Idan Peysahovich. I first met him, I think it was about 5 years ago.
7.
7 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
At least.
Time flies when you're having fun. And he was at that time the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel office over Ukraine, and he was in Kiev, in Ukraine, where I was, and so it's had a lot of interesting ramifications from that particular meeting. He's also been in Israel. Some of you were on a trip in November 2014. He spoke to us in Israel. Pam and I were in Israel one time. He and his wife were there on vacation, and so we got to spend some time with them. So it's been sort of a surprising relationship that's developed over the last few years. He's spoken here a couple of times before, and so we want to welcome him back, and he's going to be talking about what's happening in the Jewish communities, especially in the former Soviet Union, and the movements of Jews back to the land of Israel. So, Idan.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I'm really pleased to be here. It's not my first time, and I kind already feel a little bit at home in your congregation. So, and it's great to see people that we already met, and I thank you very much to Pam and Robbie for their hospitality. Really, our relationship started in Kiev a few years ago, and then I think what Robbie presented in previous session, I very much connect to what he says about Christian communities and Jewish communities working together, and we're like two hands of the same body, if I can use this allegory, or maybe two sides of the same medal. Maybe this was the point where we started to connect and talk. We find common ground. That's how our relationship went on and on. So I will try to give you a little bit of what I can say about Aliyah in general. I would like to apologize for those people who already heard me, maybe in Israel in 2014, if I repeat a few things about my personal story. But for those who I see you first time and you see me first time, I want to start a little bit from my something little personal. So as you can hear from my accent, I was born in Russia, in Siberia, descendant of Jews from Poland, Belarusia, Eastern Europe mostly. One of my grandfathers was from Poland, my grandmother was from Belarusia, and the other side from Lithuania. But by the time of the World War II, my family, my grandmothers and grandfathers ended up in Siberia. That's how our family actually settled up in this region of Soviet Union. And when I was 16 years old, my family moved to Israel. We made Aliyah. But I want to tell you just something little that for me it's a very much, I see it as a turning point for my family, and as a trigger, one of the triggers actually that brought the end to our Aliyah to Israel. In 1990, it was 1990 exactly, right before fall of former Soviet Union. We were still living in place that not exist anymore, which called Soviet Union. Two students came to visit our very distant and very small Jewish community in one of the Siberian industrial towns of Russia. One of the students was a young guy from Yeshiva University in New York, and the other one was a student from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Actually, there were two first Jews from outside of Russia. Actually, there were two first foreigners that I ever saw in my life. Before that, I only saw people in my own town, all Russians or Russian Jews, but no foreigners at all. And they came to celebrate first Hanukkah with the Jewish community in our town. What fascinates me and what I was impressed more than the Hanukkah and more than any Jewish tradition that we learned about during the celebration, the level and the freedom that those two guys expressed. They didn't do nothing special. They just behave as they behave day by day in New York or in Jerusalem. But for me, living back then in Soviet Union, I understand that there is something else in this world. There are people that can be so much free about who they are, how they can express themselves, how they can speak. And I was like, wow, if there is a places in this planet that people can feel like this, I want to be there. And as I said, one of them was American and one of them was Israeli. So from this moment, besides of my motivation and my thoughts about Aliyah, something that started to guide me, it's this journey for freedom, journey to be a free person in a free country. And till today, it's a very significant point in my life, and when I go back and see myself 25 years ago in Russia. Anyway, in less than 2 years from this point, all my family moved to Israel, and I discovered a whole new universe in front of me, studying in Israel in university, and then joining IDF for 3 years, and doing all the regular stuff that Israelis do in Israel. But most important thing that happened to me, I become a free person. And this is, I don't take it for granted, and I never will take it for granted. And when I went back to Russia and Ukraine and all these nice places to work on behalf of Israel, on behalf of Jewish Agency, this is always something that I kept in mind. You cannot take your freedom for granted. And that's also how I see the connection between United States and Israel over the history, always related to this concept of freedom from the thousands of years ago, when Jewish people decided that they go to their journey for freedom. And it's always, as I see it, always was one of the foundations why United States were created and why it's so supportive for Israel, my own perspective. So going forward actually, a little bit for talking about Aliyah, we're going forward and we're going back also in time, because the concept of Aliyah, it's something that Jewish people knew from the history all the time, since exile in Babylonia, and then before this Egypt. It's something that we always knew, and always the eyes of Jewish people were towards Jerusalem and towards land of Israel. So here you see the saying from Genesis, from Bereshit in Hebrew, that when God says to Abraham, take yourself, take your family, and go to the land that I will show you. So the concept of Aliyah is something that we always knew. And together with that we always knew, for thousands of years Jewish people were scattered, and still we have a big Jewish diaspora living everywhere. In Israel today too, thanks God, we have almost 8 million people, 8 million Jews living in Israel. So it's a big change if we go back in history and look 100 years ago, 70 years ago. So when you look in Israel today, and I know that most of you been there even not once maybe. It's a country of immigrants, as well as United States of America. You can see in Israel many cultures and many colors. You can see Jews from Ethiopia and Jews from Russia, Jews from France and Jews from Australia. From everywhere Jews came to Israel since the beginning of the century and right after the creation of state. So in 68 years, over 3 million people made Israel their home. It's a huge number when you think about it. It's a small country with very limited resources, but still I think it became very successful because of the people who made Israel their home. So why I came to Jewish Agency? As I said, after my army service, I was working in different places in Israel, nothing to do with Jewish Agency or Aliyah. I was working for Israel Airline, El Al, for many years as a flight attendant. And then, one day, I just started to think, flying all around the world and visiting different countries, where is my place? Where is my mission? What can I do for my people, for this world? And I don't know how, but I came to think about going back to former Soviet Union and trying to help those who still on the other part of the world, and trying to express how their life can be changed in Israel if they choose this option. So I came to the Jewish Agency for Israel and said I want to help. I don't know how, and for my success, or for my I don't know, I was very glad that they proposed me to go to be a counselor in summer camps in Jewish communities in former Soviet Union. So I went back for one summer, and I saw thousands of kids like myself many years ago, know nothing about Israel, know nothing about who they are, why they are, pretty much lost in space and time. And I said to myself, this is my chance. I want to be for them an example how they can change their life and find their place and start their journey for their own personal freedom. That's how I become involved with the Jewish Agency, and after 2 or 3 years I went back to Russia as a head of representative office, first in Kiev, then in Tashkent, overseeing all the Central Asia activities of the Jewish Agency for Israel, and then St. Petersburg, Russia. I wanted to show you a little bit graph that actually express in numbers waves of Aliyah right after creation of the State of Israel. You can see here that right after the creation of Israel in 1948, there was a huge mass of Jews who came to Israel. You can connect it to end of the World War II, and there was a huge amount of Jewish refugees all around the world, in Europe, in Eastern Europe. So many Jews decided to come to Israel during this period of time, 48, 49, and then in 1950, Ben Gurion, who was Prime Minister of Israel back then, before being Prime Minister of Israel, he was the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, by the way, and he actually, right after creation of the state, he became a Prime Minister, right after his position as the chairman of the Jewish Agency. So in 1950, the special operations started to bring North African Jewish communities to Israel. Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, all these Aliyah from Northern Africa came exactly during that time, 1950, 1951, 52. There was a special airlifting operation when thousands of people just landed day by day in Ben Gurion Airport. It was not Ben Gurion Airport back then, but in Israel, close to Tel Aviv. And then was a dropout in numbers, you can see, until pretty much there was a few peaks, but not as significant as it was in 1948. The next huge peak and big immigration, big Aliyah to Israel started right after fall of Soviet Union, and this is exactly the time when my family and many other Russian Jews came to Israel. So it was the beginning of 90s, 91, 92. It was almost same numbers as we saw 50 years before that. I remember that when we came to Israel, there was constantly airplanes landing in Ben Gurion Airport, like maybe 5, 7, 10 flights a day, just bringing Jews from Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe to Israel. And it was something amazing to see. And I remember when after the airport, we went to our first apartment in Holon, it's a city that's close to Tel Aviv. Every morning when we wake up, there was a plastic bag next to our door with sometimes with milk, sometimes with bread or some basic stuff. We were very touched to see it. Like every day you open the door and you don't know who brought it, but it was very, very touching just to see it. So all the country in Israel, many people in Israel, like feel that something very big and something very historical is going on. That's how people behave, just to show you day by day expression of what was it in 1990, in 1991 in Israel. And then again we saw a drop in numbers with a few peaks until 2000, year 2000, when there was another peak in Aliyah numbers. Over 60,000 Jews came during the millennium year to Israel, and then again we saw numbers going down. Actually, when you look at this graph, you can see that from 2014 we see numbers again going up and up constantly. From 2014 we saw 34,000 Jews coming to Israel in 2015, and this year 2016 we expect pretty much the same numbers, over 35,000, 34,000. So we have now a tendency that numbers are growing. This is what we see. And one of those factors, of course, I want to stop and talk a little bit about the factors that brings numbers of Aliyah up today. So first of all, Ukraine crisis that happened suddenly 2 years ago. I was based in Ukraine between 2009 and 2012. It was maybe not the richest country of the world, but it was peaceful place. And nobody, we couldn't believe that war can someday broke out between Russia and Ukraine, and we will see situation of Jewish refugees in Ukraine we couldn't believe it. And in 2014 it happened, and after many years that actually we in Jewish Agency was very skeptical about massive Aliyah from former Soviet Union. We saw it in one day, just started to happen. So the numbers from Ukraine, just to give you an example, in 2014 jumped from 2,000 a year to 6,000 just in one day. And mostly from eastern part of Ukraine, many people were airlifted, many people lost their houses, their belongings. It was very sad situations. Many times, many families, just we saw them losing everything and going to Israel literally as a refugees. This is one crisis that we just witnesses and still continues. It's a little bit better now, but still the economy is ruined, and who knows what will happen next. But the conflict is still there. So we will see. Russia's economy is going down badly. I finished my position as the head of the Jewish agency in St. Petersburg, Russia last September. So I saw it in front of my eyes. During 1 year, it was a huge drop in everything you can just think about in terms of economical situation. So the middle class in Russia is going badly down. And as usually when it happens in these regions of the world, the governmental repressions, if I may say this, become more stronger. So I always say this is my personal view. It's maybe not an official view of the Jewish Agency for Israel, but I will share with you what I think. Moses took my people for 40 years for the journey until they reached promised land and actually reached the freedom. Russia went 25 years from Soviet Union to nowadays. So they made maybe a little bit more than halfway. It's still pretty much Soviet system. That's how I see it, and it's not real freedom that person can feel living there. Again, my personal view. I may be mistaken, but this is what I see, what I feel. And we have a huge Jewish population today in Russia, over at least 500,000. I'm being very conservative in numbers. Some people say it's over 1 million, but at least being very conservative, 500,000 Jews are still living in Russia, and I'm very concerned about the future and their future, what it can be, what Russia can turn just in one day, as happened in Ukraine. So it's another factor that we need to put in front of our eyes, we at least in Israel, when we think about and plan about practical steps for the Jewish diaspora in former Soviet Union. This is something that we need to think about it and plan. Something very recently, just 2 weeks ago, a week ago, president of one of the biggest states in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, President Karimov, died after 23 or 24 years. He was the president, the first and the last president of Uzbekistan, and it's over 10,000 Jews living in Uzbekistan right now. And all Central Asia, it's another maybe 20,000-30,000 Jews in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, in Kyrgyzstan, all these places. I've been there for 2 years, based in Tashkent, traveled all around these countries, the situation is very fragile. We don't know what will happen. It definitely wasn't a democracy, Uzbekistan. We don't know who is the next president, who is the next leader of this country. All the region is actually struggling with the radicalization of Islam. All is very close to Uzbekistan. You have to understand, Uzbekistan have a border with Afghanistan. It's a very dynamic situation that can change in 1 second, and we still have in all these places a lot of Jews, a lot of Jewish communities who can't see the broader perspective sometimes, as we can see it from here or from Israel. It's very difficult to see the perspective when you all your life live in some distant small town in one of these countries, as I did in my childhood in Siberia. It's very difficult to see all of this, and it's very interesting that this kind of conversations, for example, in Uzbekistan, I won't be able to have this type of conversation, to speak about it. Russia, it's a little bit different, but a lot of different restrictions. So it's very important to see all these nuances as well. Just to share with you a little number specifically about former Soviet Union. So total number of Olim, of Jews who came in 2015 and made Israel their home, it's over 15,000 people. It's the biggest number in recent 5-7 years at least. So and it continues. I think when the situation in Russia is going to be more and more difficult economically, we will see more and more Aliyah numbers growing. And of course, same about Ukraine and Central Asia and the rest of former Soviet Union. Now I want to touch a little bit of Olim and Aliyah from English-speaking countries, and here I want to make very clear distinction. Yeah. When we speak about Aliyah from Canada, US, or any other Western country, we speak about Aliyah of choice. Aliyah of choice when Jews really have a clear choice if they want to go and live to Israel or if they want to stay and live where they're located. It's absolutely different from even today. If I speak about Middle East, Northern Africa, even the former Soviet Union. Sometimes it's a choice, but it's choice more based on economical factors, and not just choice because I want to live in Israel. So this is very different situations. So just to give you a little bit of facts of Aliyah from the West, from the English-speaking countries, we clearly see that 70% of people who choose the option to make Aliyah, those are Jews with religious affiliation. So it's based on their belief, on their faith, and it's very easy to decide this decision when you have a solid base in your faith, in your religion. So we do see it in the statistics. We also see a lot of young people in ages 18 to 30 making Aliyah to Israel for studying, for MA programs, PhD, BA programs too. And this is encouraging. So as I said, 2015 it was one of the peak years in Aliyah numbers in 12 years. But as well, We see a little bit of reduction in Aliyah from Ukraine because the situation is a little bit calmed down this year. We will see what happens next, but a little bit calmed down we see in Ukraine. And from France, you know that France was, after all the attacks that happened recent year, the Jewish community felt very unsecured. We saw many people making Aliyah from France. Over 7,000 Jews decided to come and build their home in Israel after number of attacks in France. Right now we also see a little bit reduction from France because we see that the country is trying to do a lot for securing Jewish communities in France. So it's reflected in Aliyah numbers. And in contrast, we see a lot of more people interested in Aliyah from Latin America, Brazil, Venezuela, mostly from the economical instability, political instability. It's all factors that actually brings people to think more and more about moving to Israel. Now France, just to give you a little bit of numbers, as I said, 2015, 7,800 Olim came from France. It's unbelievable numbers for France. If you can see 2013, a little bit over 3,000. 2014 started big wave, over 7,000, and then it continued to next year. We don't have numbers now for 2016. We will see at the end of the year, but for now we see a little bit of reduction from France. Brazil, I told you. Latin America, we clearly see more people deciding to come to Israel, and more people are turning to the Jewish agency offices to receive a consultation. And if we just see all the Aliyah numbers, how it divided between different countries. So in the West, 52% last year came from France, 21 from US. If I take all the number of Olim from Western countries, and you can see England 5%, etc., etc. So the biggest wave was still from France, with all the reductions. Just a little bit about ages again. The majority of people that come to Israel as Olim between ages of 0 to 35. It's over 60%, which is, Israel is a very young country. A lot of children, if you go there, you see a lot of children. Our kindergartens, now schools, the average class, it's 32, 33 children in the class, in kindergarten, in the school. Sometimes it's very difficult for teachers, but it's only because we have a lot of young generation, a lot of kids. So in Aliyah it's also reflected. Many families with young children decide to come to Israel. And those are the numbers about education. So you can see here that 27% of all the Olim holding BA degrees, 11% holding MA degrees, 6% holding PhD degrees. It's a huge contribution to the state of Israel. It's amazing. I can tell you that in beginning of 19th, when Russian speakers came to Israel, a lot of engineers and doctors and musicians, it was a huge contribution. Everybody knows it. Today there is almost no place in Israel, no hospital, no medical school, no musical school that you go and you don't see Russian speakers that establish themselves as a teachers, as a professors, as an engineers, and it's great. It's great for the country. a little bit about religious affiliation. As I said, the majority of people, we see that they affiliate themselves with one of the movements in Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and just a minority of people affiliate themselves or say that they're not affiliated or secular or something like that. The vast majority of people, maybe it's excluding former Soviet Union, when Soviet Union did everything they could to kill anything that connected to religious faith and belief. So we grew up as a Soviet citizens without a connection to our culture, to our heritage, to our religion. This is a sad story, but it is true. And the majority of Jews who came from former Soviet Union, they cannot affiliate themselves. The vast majority cannot affiliate themselves with any specific denomination or specific movement. In Israel, situation is changing. So best absorption, I always say, the best Jewish education you can get to child in former Soviet Union, it's to bring him to Israel. It's the best Jewish education you can do, to bring him to Israel or her to Israel. That's the best investment in Jewish education you can do. So, and of course, after people come and settle down in Israel, you have to do a lot to absorb them in Israel. You have to do a lot of programs, and you have to do a lot of efforts to connect them to the general public, to society in Israel. So this is what we do in Jewish Agency, just to show you a few examples for programs that we do in Israel for young adults, for young professionals. It's a network of Ulpanim. Ulpan, it's the place that people study Hebrew. It's provided for free, 5 months. Every new immigrant can study Hebrew. It doesn't matter where he decides to settle down in Israel. There's employment programs with municipalities, absorption centers, absorption program in the kibbutzim. It's a huge network of absorbing new comers, new citizens of Israel in Israel. Olim LaNegev, it's a new program in Sderot, for example, just specifically for young adults ages 21, 35, that they settle down in Sderot, one of the cities in Negev, and got guidance and help and assistance in employment. Same programs in Netanya, which is close to Tel Aviv, and another program in Negev, a place called Ibim. Again, you can see the ages. It's especially designed for young adults to connect them and to integrate them into the Israel society. Not only language, but assistance in finding the job, guidance about higher education, everything they need, and of course language. Language, they have to study Hebrew from the first moment. Professional programs for drivers, for maintenance workers in hotels in Be'er Sheva, high-tech programs for computer engineers, all doctors and licensed professionals for medical industry. Those are all programs for newcomers that designed especially to integrate them into Israel. And one of our flagship programs, it's of course assistance to lone soldiers. We have a lot of lone soldiers coming to Israel because their families, their parents left behind in the countries that they came from. They decided to make Aliyah and joined IDF. We have the biggest number, by the way, of lone soldiers serving today in IDF. They are coming from North America, mostly US, Canada. Then second place, it's the former Soviet Union. They all need a lot of assistance. a lot of guidance. You know, they finish the army service every 2-3 weeks. They can go for weekends, and they have no place to go. They have no families in Israel. So those are programs that designed for them not to feel alone, not to feel lonely soldiers. Very important ones that we have, and many different ministries and many different organizations involved with us in order to make life of these soldiers a little bit more easier and relaxed when they have a chance, you know, to spend the free weekend after very difficult service. And just one word about Aliyah of Rescue. I don't want to talk about it too much because it's a very sensitive issue. But since the beginning, Jewish Agency was, and still, sometimes first responder for the different situations that Jewish communities go through. Just to give you a number, 60,000 Jews today, as we speak, live in the countries where they are constantly at risk. It's a big number. And when I speak about risk, it's risk. It's a life danger, and we don't want to talk about it too much. But you can be sure that we do every day for these communities to get them safely to Israel and help them if they need help everywhere, doesn't matter where. Just to give you a little bit of examples, we still have communities in Northern Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Jewish communities. We have very interesting situation now in Turkey with very large Jewish community. We need to be very careful and monitor what is going on and what is the next for Turkey. I mentioned already Central Asia, Iran, pretty large Jewish community. Yes, inside. So all of those cases, of course, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time and plan and thinking how and when and what to do. And just finishing my speech, and if you have questions, I would love to answer. We constantly look and need, and we know that we have a lot of supporters all around the world, and Jewish communities and Christian communities as your own congregation. We are standing together, we will stand together, and thank you very much for being with us all these times. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I don't know if we have time, Robbie, but
Yes, we have time.
please. Yes.
All right, we have time. I'll stumble but not fall.
Can you comment on the Aliyah from Ethiopia? According, I guess, the government of Israel, they came to the conclusion that all the Ethiopian Jews are already in Israel. They don't want any more people from Ethiopia, but the Ethiopian community, they still have relatives there. So can you comment on that, please?
Yes, I can comment a little bit on it. I'm not really much aware about the recent developments, but it's something that we know from at least recent 30 years, that every year, approximately every year, the government of Israel said, okay, we finished, we completed operation for Aliyah from Ethiopia, and then next year we start again. And then again we complete it and we start again. So it's very interesting situation, because one of the points that you raised is absolutely true. Many of Ethiopian Jews who are already in Israel, they claim that they still have families and they still have relatives, it's very difficult to track it. That's the difficulty, because many of them have no any documentations, and to track it, to see the connection and relative and siblings, it's something that's very, very difficult. But I know that after, I think it was last year, when Israel again said that we completed Aliyah from Ethiopia, we started again. So it's continuous. It still continues.
Okay, I've got one question back here.
It's a governmental decision. That's why it's so.
What's your definition between traditional and Orthodox Jew?
I'm not sure I can answer your question.
I saw it on one of your slides.
Yeah, but mostly there are synagogues, there are congregations that consider themselves as Orthodox, and you can see it in states very easily. And there are another congregation that consider and themselves and present themselves as a Reform Jews and conservative Jews. So I don't know to give you rabbinical definition. I just don't know. But in Israel it's the same story. They are Orthodox and the Reform and conservative and Reconstructionists. We have many. I don't know to give you a rabbinical definition.
Two things. You used the word olim. I don't know what that means. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I know, but olim.
Okay, olim is actually people who make Aliyah.
Oh, okay. The second
Ole is the person who makes Aliyah.
Okay, thank you. The second thing is, I'm aware of a thriving high-tech industry, medical, pharmaceutical, computer, thriving, and maybe the Tel Aviv and other areas.
Haifa,
Are
huge
people,
center of high-tech.
I don't know how Russians could fit in there. I don't know, but can you comment on that? I mean, it's people here want to invest in Israeli high tech, which has done amazing things so far. So can you comment on that? Who's coming in for that?
I can only support what you just said. Sometimes Israelis even don't realize that we are high-tech superpower. Israel is a high-tech superpower, and a lot of inventions, starting from our cell phone and flash cards, were just invented in Israel. So, besides of saying that yes, you are absolutely right, and we know that we are very big, a global power in everything that connected to high-tech industry and pharmaceutical industry too. The Russian speakers, some of them fit this unique situation, and some of them integrated into Israel software and engineering companies. I would say a significant number of them actually find themselves working for Israeli high-tech industry in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Herzliya. Yes, absolutely, you're right. Yes. I can support only what you said.
If you want to read a good book on it, read Startup Nation.
Startup Nation
by Dan Senior, and I forget who he wrote it with his brother-in-law. I can't remember his name right now, but yeah, that's an excellent book. We got time for one more question.
On your slide of religious affiliations, I didn't see, and correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't see a category for Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, Messianic Jews. Are there any of those that come to Israel?
I'll tell you again, my view, it's my personal view. I don't know if there is some official point of view, so to speak, but my personal view that this is something that Israel will need to think about and to work with it in the coming years, because it's just something that we recently many people in Israel recently just realized that there is another denomination, especially in the Western world, because in Russia you don't see it almost, like very, very little. And I don't know if there is any specific point of view in Israel about it. I think that we still in a situation that in Israel many people just don't realize it. And I see that we will need to address it in the coming years. Today, tomorrow, it's definitely something that it's coming up. I never heard any specific official or semi-official point of view on what you said. This is something that we need to start discussing. It's like not exist for many Israelis.
And one of the things that I've heard recently is that there's less of a, I mean, this is a broad general statement, but there's less of a hostility towards Messianic Jews that's developing even in the U.S. Now, that's not true for every community, but in some they're just viewed as another Jewish community, that idea is beginning to have more of a whole. But, there's still big segments that have a lot of hostility toward Messianic Jews. And I know, what was his name, the founder of Jews for Jesus, Moshe Rosen? Yeah, when he died a few years ago, there was some unfortunate rejoicing in the Jewish community over that because of a lot of bad feelings that had developed over the years. But hopefully that's
Let me add something to what you say. I also think many things depends on the leaders of this community, of these denominations, to start a dialogue, significant dialogue with leadership of Israel, of Israelis organization, Jewish organization, and to take it to another level. I think the time is probably coming for it. So it very much depends of how the leadership of the movement, if there is a movement, how they want to present and how they want to address it to the general Israeli Jewish community and public.
Okay, that's in this session. We'll come back in 10 minutes. We'll reboot the system, so those live streaming need to get off and then come back on. We'll reboot, take a break. Let me remind you that about the offering, that we have costs related to the conference, and there's a couple of metal boxes on the back. Pick the one with West Houston Bible Church. If you make out a check, make the check out to West Houston Bible Church, and you can put a donation in there to help take care of the costs of the conference. We'll resume in